He found a helicopter in the mountains that had been kept secret for decades. But what he found inside compelled him to continue his journey and uncover the secret that others had tried to hide. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The morning was still and cold when Leon Santos rose from his narrow bed. The cabin smelled faintly of wood smoke and antiseptic from the supplies he kept in the corner. A reminder that even here, on the edge of the mountains, he remained half a medic and half a man seeking to vanish. He dressed without haste, layering thermal shirt, fleece, and jacket with the same quiet ritual he had once used to pull on body armor in forward operating bases overseas. It had been years since he left the military, years since he had knelt in the dust beside men whose blood seeped between his fingers faster than he could stop it. But the rhythm of those days had carved itself into him like a scar that would never fade. Outside, the air was sharp enough to bite the inside of his nose. The peaks were crowned in white, their flanks shaded in blue as the first light slid across them. Leon stood still for a moment, his breath forming pale clouds before him, and let the silence sink into his bones. This was why he came to the mountains as often as he could. Not for adventure, not for conquest, but for this very moment when the world seemed to pause and his own thoughts fell into a rare kind of order. He strapped on his pack, tightened the waist belt until it sat snug on his hips, and set out along the narrow trail that wound into the hills. His boots struck the frozen ground with a deliberate rhythm. Each step felt like a kind of penance, one he willingly accepted. The town behind him faded quickly into memory. Up here there were no cars, no radios, no voices but the sound of wind in the trees and the faint calling of birds still lingering at the lower elevations. The first part of the climb was easy, the trail still soft with needles and earth. The scent of pine resin clung to the air, damp and comforting, and every now and then a shaft of sunlight pierced the canopy to touch the forest floor with gold. Leon walked without hurry, though his muscles warmed and his breath came more steadily as the incline grew steeper. He welcomed the gradual burn in his legs, the throb of his heartbeat in his ears. These sensations made him feel real, as if the world outside his skin had been stripped away, leaving only the mountain and the man climbing it. By midday, the trees began to thin, shrinking into crooked, wind-gnarled shapes before vanishing altogether. The ground turned to stone, hard and unforgiving, and the trail became less of a path and more of a suggestion scratched into the mountainside. Leon stopped once, resting his hands on his knees, and looked back. The valley below spread out like a green and brown map, the roofs of the town barely visible against the patchwork of meadow and forest. He felt that familiar detachment creeping over him, the sense that the rest of the world was receding into a place where it could no longer touch him. He turned back to the climb and pushed on. The air thinned, and every breath scraped his throat, but the sky above was a deep, crystalline blue, and the light had a quality that felt almost holy. When the trail curved around a massive outcrop, Leon caught something out of the corner of his eye, a glint of light that didn't belong. He stopped, squinting into the glare. At first he thought it might be a patch of ice catching the sun, but the flash was too precise, too sharp. Curiosity prickled the back of his neck. He stepped off the trail, careful of his footing, and made his way over the uneven ground toward the source of the reflection. The glint came again as the sun shifted, and then, as he rounded a tumble of boulders, he saw it fully. The helicopter lay on its side as if a giant had swatted it from the sky. Its rotor blades were twisted and bent, one embedded deep into the scree like a broken spear. The fuselage was scarred, the paint flayed away by wind and time, yet the machine was unmistakable. Not a rescue chopper, not a sightseeing craft, but something heavier, darker. A military or government bird, though the insignia on its side had long since faded into ghostly shapes. Leon stood very still, his pack pressing against his shoulders as if trying to hold him back. He had seen wrecks before during his service, smoldering husks still radiating heat, but never one so old, so silent. The air around it felt different, charged with the kind of stillness that comes after a storm. After a long pause, he approached. The helicopter's windows were shattered, the cockpit glass lying in shards that crunched beneath his boots. The door hung twisted on its hinges, leaving a gap just wide enough for him to squeeze through. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with the smell of rust and something else, a faint sweet odor of fabric long shut away from light. He switched on his flashlight, the beam cutting through the dimness, and saw the interior for the first time. The seats were torn, stuffing protruding in yellowed clumps. Dust hung in the air, swirling lazily in the light. Near the rear compartment, someone had built a small fire, the blackened stones still arranged in a rough circle. Scorched scraps of bandages lay nearby, brittle with age. A trail of dark brown stains led from the fire to the wall, where words had been scratched into the metal with something sharp. "Don't trust," and below it, "Heading north." Leon crouched and touched the markings, feeling the rough edges beneath his glove. The words carried a weight that made his throat tighten. He imagined the hand that had carved them, perhaps shaking, perhaps driven by desperation. He stood again and swept the beam around the cabin. The scene told its story in fragments. Someone had been badly hurt, someone else had tried to keep them alive. They had stayed here for some time before leaving. But where had they gone? And why did no one ever find them? Leon's pulse quickened, though not with fear exactly. It was the old feeling, the one that used to take hold when a call came over the radio, and he had to run towards someone's pain rather than away from it. He forced himself to breathe slowly, to steady the sudden rush in his chest. After several minutes, he backed out of the wreck, blinking in the sunlight that seemed too bright after the shadowed interior. The wind had picked up, tugging at his jacket, and the peaks above loomed like sentinels. He stood there for a long moment, listening to the hollow sound of the air moving through the broken rotor blades, until it seemed almost like a voice. When he finally turned away, his steps were slow and deliberate. The trail back to camp felt longer than before, his pack heavier. He could not stop replaying what he had seen. The fire ring, the bloodstains, the carved message. By the time he reached the place where he had pitched his tent, the decision had already taken root in him. He would return. That night, sleep came in restless snatches. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the helicopter lying like a wounded animal on the stones, its windows like blind eyes staring at him. The wind rattled the nylon of his tent and moaned through the rocks, and more than once he sat up, heart hammering, sure he had heard footsteps just outside. But there was only the dark in the mountain and the faint glimmer of stars overhead. When dawn came, pale and cold, Leon was already awake, packing his gear with the methodical focus of a man who knows exactly what he must do. The memory of the wreck pulled at him like gravity. He was no longer simply hiking the mountain for peace. Now there was a question waiting for him in the high places, one he could not leave unanswered. Leon rose with the first light, his body stiff from the night, but his mind sharpened by resolve. The mountains were cloaked in a blue-gray silence that seemed deeper than the night had been. He broke down his tent with precise, practiced motions, rolling each strap tight, checking every pocket of his pack as though he were preparing for a mission. The decision he had made the previous evening had hardened into something heavier now. Not just curiosity, but an obligation. The helicopter had been more than a wreck. It had been a place of struggle, perhaps the last battlefield for the people who had lived through the crash, and something inside him would not allow him to turn his back on it. The ascent felt different this morning. His breath steamed in the frigid air, hanging like ghosts around him before the wind tore them away. His boots crunched on the crusted snow and gravel, the sound loud in the otherwise still morning. The sun had only just begun to edge above the distant peaks, staining the sky with a weak pink light. Leon's thoughts were as methodical as his steps. He reviewed what he had seen, the fire ring, the scorched bandages, the carved words on the wall. These were fragments of a story, and he intended to piece them together. When he reached the boulder field and saw the twisted silhouette of the helicopter again, he felt a shiver crawl up his spine. In the dawn light, the wreck looked both more fragile and more defiant, as though it had been waiting for him through the night. He approached it slowly, his boots leaving prints in the frost that had settled on the stones. The rotor blades cast long, skeletal shadows that stretched across the ground like accusing fingers. Leon switched on his flashlight and ducked once more into the fractured cabin. The stale air seemed heavier today, as if it remembered his intrusion. Dust motes drifted through the beam of light, settling again slowly, as if reluctant to be disturbed. He started at the front this time, methodically examining the cockpit. The glass of the instrument panel was cracked and dulled with grime. The needles on the gauges were frozen in strange positions, telling the story of a descent that had gone violently wrong. The pilot's seat was torn loose on one side, hanging at an angle, its harness shredded. He crouched, running gloved fingers along the floor, brushing aside debris, imagining the chaos of that final moment, the jolt of impact, the rain of shattered glass, the smell of hydraulic fluid and burning insulation. He moved toward the rear compartment, where the floor tilted downward slightly. The smell of old smoke was stronger here, the memory of fire still clinging to the metal. It was near the back that he found the container. The box was metal, battered on one side where it had struck something hard, but the latch was still holding. He knelt and pried it open, the metal screeching faintly in protest, and then froze as he looked inside. Bundles of papers lay bound with discolored fabric tape. Maps, some torn and others nearly pristine, had been carefully folded. On their yellowing surfaces were routes marked in heavy pencil, arcs and crosses that made no sense at first glance. Alongside the maps were sheaves of typed reports, the pages brittle but still legible. He lifted one carefully, tilting it toward the light. The words leapt at him. Special cargo, restricted flight path, security required. A date in the corner, faded but still readable, placed the crash decades in the past. Long enough that no one alive might even remember this flight had ever taken off. Leon replaced the page gently and continued through the contents. Beneath the documents were smaller envelopes, some empty, some sealed with wax that had long since cracked. A few had stamps from foreign countries, their postmarks blurred, as if they had been gathered from many places. Whatever this flight had been, it was no ordinary transport run. The paperwork spoke of a mission, something clandestine. He rose slowly and turned toward the seating area. There, half wedged between two seats, he saw something he had missed the previous day. A small leather-bound journal, its cover warped, but intact. He pulled it free and brushed the dust away. The paper inside was stiff, the ink faded to brown, but the handwriting was elegant, careful. He read by the beam of his flashlight, catching fragments of thought. References to a rendezvous, notes on weather delays, and finally a line that made the hair rise on his arms. We must keep the key safe, even if we fall. The last entry stopped abruptly, as though the writer had been interrupted. Leon sat back on his heels, the journal open in his hands, and let out a slow breath. His pulse had quickened again, that old familiar rush that came in the moments before decisions that could not be undone. The words on the wall had spoken of heading north. Now the journal spoke of a key, something that had been worth protecting even as the helicopter went down. He placed the journal carefully into his pack, along with a selection of the papers and maps. The rest he left undisturbed. He could not carry everything, and he felt a strange sense of trespass as it was. Rising, he swept the flashlight around the cabin one more time, letting his gaze rest on each scar, each twisted piece of metal, as if committing it to memory. When he stepped outside again, the sun had climbed higher, casting the entire slope in hard white light. The air was cold and biting, but it cleared his head. He stood for a long moment with the wreck behind him and the peaks rising in silence before him. He could feel the weight of the documents and the journal in his pack, a physical reminder of the responsibility he had taken on. He thought of the coordinates carved into the wall, the desperate message left behind by someone who had lived long enough to leave a warning. The north lay beyond the ridge, through terrain that would be even more treacherous than what he had already crossed. He knew the risks. He had seen too many men push beyond their limits in environments like this. But he also knew that if he walked away now, the questions would never leave him. By the time Leon turned back toward his camp, the decision was already made. He would follow the trail. The helicopter had given him pieces of a story. Somewhere beyond the ridge, the rest of it waited, buried in snow and stone. He would go and see for himself what fate had done to the ones who had carved their warning into the wall. The descent back to the tent was quiet, his footsteps crunching steadily in the frost. Above him, the sky was sharpening toward the pale blue of midday, but in his chest he felt a growing heaviness. He remembered the fire ring and the scorched bandages, the line of bloodstains leading to the wall. He thought of the hand that had carved the words, of the effort it must have taken to stand in this freezing cabin and scratch out letters one by one. Back at camp, he prepared a quick meal, forcing himself to eat though his appetite had fled. He sat on a flat rock with the journal open across his knees, reading and rereading the fragments of text as the sun slid lower across the sky. Each page seemed to weigh more than the last. This was no ordinary tragedy, no random accident. The helicopter had been carrying something secret, something worth hiding, and perhaps worth killing for. As evening fell, Leon packed his gear for the next day, laying out his rope, his spare batteries, his water. The air grew colder, and he pulled his jacket tighter, listening to the mountain wind begin its nightly howl. He knew that tomorrow he would not simply be a hiker any longer. He would be a tracker, a seeker of lost trails, following the path of those who had vanished into the north. When darkness finally wrapped around the camp, he climbed into his sleeping bag and lay staring at the thin fabric of the tent overhead. The stars burned like icy embers beyond the nylon, but he saw only the interior of the helicopter, the maps, the journal, the scratched words. Somewhere up there, beyond the ridge, the rest of the story waited for him. The thought chilled him more than the night air, but it also steadied him. He would go. He could not do otherwise. Sleep came late, but when it came, it was deep, as though the mountain itself had decided to grant him rest before the next trial. The morning broke sharp and cloudless, the peaks shining like silver against the pale sky. Leon woke before dawn, the chill inside the tent biting at his face, and lay for a moment listening to the rasp of his own breath. The decision he had made the night before weighed on him like a second pack, but it was a weight he accepted. He packed carefully as though each strap and buckle mattered more than usual. The journal and papers he had taken from the wreck lay deep in his rucksack, wrapped in plastic to protect them from the cold and snow. He checked the batteries of his flashlight twice, slipped extra energy bars into his jacket pocket, and tightened the laces of his boots until they cut slightly at his ankles. When he stepped out of the tent, the air was knife-edged, thin enough to make his lungs ache. His breath plumed in front of him as he shouldered his gear and turned toward the ridge where the carved words had pointed him. The snow crunched beneath his boots as he moved, the sound loud and solitary in the vast quiet. The wreck lay behind him now, out of sight, but he felt it at his back like an unseen witness. The first stretch of the trail was steep, winding upward through a narrow defile where snow had drifted in deep, soft patches that swallowed his boots to the ankle. His legs burned, but he welcomed the pain. The rhythm of exertion steadied his mind. When he crested the rise, the land opened before him into a barren expanse of stone and wind-scoured snowfields. The north lay spread out like a map, ridges and valleys leading away into the distance. Somewhere out there the survivors had walked, dragging themselves through this same hostile terrain. He moved cautiously, eyes scanning for anything out of place. It was mid-morning before he found the first sign, a circle of blackened stones half buried in snow, the faint memory of a fire that must have burned years ago. The wood was long gone, but the arrangement was too deliberate to be natural. He crouched, brushing away frost with his glove, and pictured figures huddled around the weak flame, their breath fogging in the night air, their faces hollowed by exhaustion. Further on, he found rusted cans scattered among the rocks, their lids pried open with rough edges. He shook one, hearing nothing but the rattle of rust flakes inside. The markings were faded, but he recognized military-issue rations from decades past. Someone had eaten here, fought to stay alive before moving on. Leon stood slowly, scanning the horizon, and kept walking. The day wore on and the air grew colder despite the weak sun overhead. The silence pressed heavier as the hours passed, broken only by the crunch of his boots and the occasional rattle of loose stones. The sensation of being watched grew stronger, an itch between his shoulder blades that no amount of glancing over his shoulder could shake. The wind carried strange sounds, not words but sighs and faint whistles that seemed to come from nowhere. He reminded himself that the mountains were full of tricks, that wind could mimic voices, that fear could sharpen the senses until they invented threats that were not there. And yet he found himself gripping his trekking pole tighter, as if it could serve as a weapon. Late in the afternoon, he saw the outline of the bunker. It crouched against the base of a cliff, half buried by rock slides and time. Its metal door was bent and gaping, the concrete around it cracked and crumbling. He approached carefully, every sense alert. The wind had died here, leaving a stillness that felt unnatural. Inside, the air was musty, trapped for decades. Leon switched on his flashlight and swept the beam across the interior. The floor was littered with debris, broken crates, rusted cans, a shattered lantern. In the far corner lay a ring of stones, like the fire pits he had seen outside. Ash still clung to them in a thin gray layer. He crouched, sifting the dust through his fingers, feeling the grit of charcoal. They had been here too. Then the beam of his flashlight caught something that made him freeze. Against the far wall, slumped in the shadow, was a human figure, or what remained of one. The bones were mostly intact, the clothing reduced to rags that clung like cobwebs. A rusted canteen lay nearby, and beside it a torn piece of fabric that might once have been a flag, its colors long since faded to ghosts. Leon's throat tightened as he crouched near the remains. The skull was tilted back, the empty socket staring at the ceiling as though in mute accusation. He stayed there for a long time, the silence broken only by his own breathing, before he noticed the scrap of paper beneath one bony hand. He reached out carefully and slid it free. The paper was brittle, the ink smeared but still legible. The words were few but chilling. "We are not alone. If you find this, run. They will come." The last letters trailed into a dark smear, as though the writer had collapsed while finishing. The date, scrawled in the corner, was nearly a week after the helicopter must have crashed. Leon sat back on his heels, the paper trembling in his gloved hand. The bunker was suddenly colder, the air thicker. He turned his flashlight around the walls, catching deep scratches etched into the concrete. Tally marks counting days or perhaps nights. There were dozens of them, then abruptly they stopped. He rose slowly, backing toward the entrance, his heart hammering. The stillness of the place felt suffocating now, as though it was holding its breath. Outside, the air felt almost warm by comparison, though it bit at his face. He stood for a long time staring back into the darkness of the bunker, as if expecting someone, or something, to emerge. As he set off again, the light was fading fast, the sky deepening to the color of steel. The wind returned, sharp and restless, sweeping snow in thin veils across the ground. Leon found a sheltered hollow among the rocks and pitched his tent there, his hands moving quickly, more from unease than cold. When night came, he lay awake, listening to the wind moan through the stones. The image of the bones in the bunker would not leave him. Neither would the words on the paper. Not alone. Who had been here with them? What had they feared so much that their final message was a warning to run? The darkness outside seemed full of movement. More than once he thought he heard footsteps crunching in the snow beyond the thin nylon wall, slow and deliberate. Each time he held his breath, straining to listen, until the sound faded into the wind. His hand rested on the handle of his knife, though he knew it would do little good if whatever haunted these mountains chose to reveal itself. Sleep finally took him just before dawn, shallow and uneasy. When he woke, the sun was only a pale smudge on the horizon, and his decision had solidified into something harder than fear. He would keep following the trail. Whatever had happened to the survivors, whoever or whatever they had feared, he had to know. He packed his gear with slow deliberation, tucking the brittle paper safely into the journal where it would not be lost. The wind had died again, leaving an eerie hush over the landscape. The path ahead led toward the glacier he had glimpsed the day before, its pale surface gleaming under the early light. Somewhere up there, the last steps of the survivors were waiting, preserved in snow or erased entirely by time. Leon set his face toward the north and began to walk. Each step felt heavier now, not just from fatigue, but from the weight of the story he was carrying. The mountain had given him a glimpse of the past, but it had also issued a challenge. He could feel it in the air, in the silence that watched him. He was no longer just a hiker, he was the last witness. Leon rose to a world drained of all color. The dawn was brittle, the sky a sheet of pale metal, the glacier ahead gleaming like a frozen ocean under a sun too weak to warm anything it touched. He broke camp without hurry, moving with the precision of a man who knows that mistakes at this point could cost him dearly. Each strap was checked, each buckle pulled snug, and the brittle paper he had found in the bunker was once again tucked safely in the journal at the heart of his pack. When he set out, the snow crunched loudly beneath his boots, each step an affirmation of the decision he had made. He would follow the trail as far as it would take him, even if it meant walking into the teeth of the mountain. The path led upward into a narrowing gorge where the wind funneled between sheer rock faces. Snow had drifted deep here, masking the uneven ground and forcing him to test every step before putting his weight down. His breath came hard and ragged, the cold air searing his lungs. More than once he had to stop, leaning on his trekking pole, to gather his strength before pushing on. The silence of the place was immense, broken only by the occasional groan of ice somewhere ahead, a deep and distant sound that vibrated through the ground like the slow breathing of some sleeping giant. By midday he reached the edge of the glacier. It rose before him in ridges and crests, an undulating expanse of white that caught the light like hammered glass. He stood there for a long time, staring at the smooth surface. If there had been tracks here once, they were long gone, erased by years of storms and shifting ice. The survivor's path ended here, not in a clear conclusion, but in a white void. Leon stepped onto the glacier carefully, planting his boots where the snow looked firmest, and made his way a little way across the hard-packed surface. The wind had risen again, sweeping powder into veils that curled around his legs. He imagined the figures he had been following, exhausted, half-frozen, stumbling across this same ground with their last strength. Had they tried to cross to some other valley? Had they built a shelter somewhere among the crevasses? Or had the mountain simply swallowed them whole, burying them beyond finding? He reached a point where the ice sloped downward into a dark crack, wide enough to swallow a man. He crouched near the edge, peering down into the blue-lit depths where the glacier yawned open like a throat. A faint wind sighed up from below, carrying the smell of ancient ice, a smell so pure and cold it burned his nostrils. For a long moment he considered climbing down, searching the crevasse for anything that might have fallen in. Bones, equipment, some fragment of the key they had carried. But instinct held him back. This was not a place where a man should linger. The mountain had made its verdict here, and stepping further might only add his name to the list of the lost. He sat on the ice, pulling off his glove to run a bare hand over the cold surface. It was smooth, impenetrable, like a door closed forever. Whatever story had played out here had ended, and no living witness could say how. Leon felt the weight of the journal and papers in his pack pressing against his spine. They were all he could take away, the only voices left to speak for those who had walked this path before him. After a time, he rose and turned back toward the south. The decision felt final, as though some unseen hand had written an ending in the snow. The descent began slowly, his legs stiff from the cold and the long climb. Each step had to be tested, the ice beneath him slick and treacherous. Twice he slipped and caught himself with his hands, the sharp sting of pain shooting through his palms where the gloves tore against rough edges. His knees throbbed with the effort, but he pressed on, driven by something beyond mere survival. The wind increased as he left the glacier behind, turning into a steady gale that pushed against him like a living thing. Snow began to fall, light at first, then heavier, swirling around him until the trail behind vanished. The world narrowed to the space just ahead of his boots, and for a time he moved like a sleepwalker, each step a small victory. Fatigue gnawed at him, his shoulders aching beneath the weight of his pack, his thighs trembling with exertion. But beneath the exhaustion, there was a strange clarity, as though the mountain was stripping everything from him except the will to keep moving. By the time he reached the lower slopes, the snow had stopped, leaving a pale hush over the land. The wreck of the helicopter was far behind him now, invisible even in memory, except as a dark silhouette against the white. He felt as though he had crossed some invisible line, moving from the domain of the dead back into the world of the living. He stopped at a plateau where the rocks broke through the snow and dropped his pack. The last light of day was staining the peaks with rose and gold. He sat on a boulder, chest heaving, and pulled the journal from his pack. For days he had resisted opening the final pages, afraid they might crumble in his hands, afraid too of what truths they might reveal. But here, with the mountains beginning to fall away behind him, he felt the moment had come. The handwriting was careful but hurried. The ink faded but still readable. He traced the words with a gloved finger as he read. References to negotiations, to assets, to names of men and companies he did not know, but that sounded like titans of some vanished age, and always the references to the key, to the need to protect it, to the fear of it falling into the wrong hands. The final entry was only a few words. If we do not return, let the record speak for us. We did what we could. Leon closed the journal and held it against his chest. The wind tugged at his hood, whispering around him like a voice too quiet to hear clearly. The survivors had tried to leave their story behind, and now he was the only one who could carry it forward. It was not triumph he felt, but a kind of mourning. For them, for the secrecy that had buried them, for the knowledge that the mountain would keep its final secrets forever. He shouldered his pack again and continued down, the valleys below opening wider with every step. The shadows lengthened, and soon the first stars pierced the sky. Somewhere down there lay villages, roads, the noise of the world he had left behind. Yet as he descended, he felt no lighter. The weight he carried was not just the paper and ink in his pack, but the silence of the dead, the echo of their footsteps across the snow, the hollow stare of the skull in the bunker. When he reached the last rise before the lower slopes, he turned and looked back. The peaks stood dark against the starlit sky, their crowns veiled in mist. The glacier was hidden now, the wreck long out of sight, but he could feel them still, watching. He knew that part of him would never come down from those heights. Part of him would remain there, sitting by the cold fire in the wreck, tracing tally marks on a bunker wall, staring into the white mouth of the glacier, and waiting for an answer that would never come. He turned at last and resumed his descent. Each step carried him farther from the place where metal and stone had met in violence, but none of them freed him from what he had found. He no longer walked alone. The mountain had given him its secret and demanded a price. The wind at his back seemed almost to speak, though its words were lost in the rustle of snow. When he finally reached the shelter of the lower valley and saw the faint lights of the town far below, Leon stopped and stood for a long moment in the darkness. Then he began to walk again, slow but steady. He had survived, but survival was no ending. He was a witness now, and witnesses carried burdens as heavy as any pack. The mountains behind him loomed like silent judges, their peaks cutting into the stars. He felt their gaze on his back until the path curved and they vanished from view, leaving him with nothing but the weight of the story he would never be able to forget. If this story kept you watching until the end, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Take a moment to watch our other videos for more stories like this. And don't forget to share this video with your friends. Some stories are too powerful to keep to yourself.